Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, or whatever the case may be. My name is Marcus, and I'm the host of the Black Brazil Today channel, where I discuss Brazil from the perspective of race. Now, this is going to be one of my first videos in several years, but I've been blogging since about November of 2011. So if you are not familiar with my work, I know a lot of people have been following my blog for some years, but if you're not familiar with my blog, definitely go and check me out at blackwomenofbrazil.co, blackwomenofbrazil.co. Um, just to give you a little bit of history about me, I've been into the racial situation in Brazil for 2 decades now. Just to get into just, okay, why Brazil? A lot of people ask me that, it's come up over the years, and I always give the same general answer. I'm from Detroit, Michigan originally. And for a number of years, I've been, educating myself on the situation of the global Black or African population. And if for people who are from Detroit, you probably remember a bookstore on Livernois Avenue that was called the Shrine of the Black Madonna. It was a bookstore and cultural shop. You could just go in there and get all types of books, literature, studies, fiction, nonfiction. I used to spend a lot of time in that bookstore. And I'll never forget, on December 24th of 1999, Christmas Eve 1999, I found this book, an encyclopedia-sized book called Africana, the Encyclopedia of the African and African American Experience. Book probably has about 2,000 pages in it. So, I ended up taking that book home. It was a present to myself for Christmas, right? And I was fascinated with all of the stuff that was in there, in general. But what really struck me was the sections on Latin America. And I was just fascinated to find out how many articles this book had in it on Brazil, Brazilian history, Black Brazilian personalities that I had never heard of. At the time, or, if you're like most African Americans who are not familiar with people from Latin America, probably the only Brazilian that you really know, well, at least up until, say 20 years ago, was probably, the great football star, the great soccer star, Pelé. Besides that, we're not really familiar much with the Black population in Brazil. As a matter of fact, this is the first thing that caught my eye as I'm reading through this certain sections of the Africana Encyclopedia. They estimate that the Black Brazilian population is anywhere from 50 to 120 million people. I think they left it at somewhere like 75 million, because it's an iffy topic. You can't really calculate exactly how many Black people there are in Brazil. And I'm going to get into those reasons in a minute. But my first thought was, how is it that there are that many Black people in Brazil and I didn't know anything about them? I mean, when you grow up as an African American, you might be familiar with, obviously people from the African continent. You might be familiar with Jamaican people. You might be familiar with, a lot of Black people from the Caribbean, but you don't really think of Black people when you think of Brazil. I know I didn't. Generally, when you think of people in South America, at least for most Black people, we generally think of people who have a sort of European indigenous mixture type look, the type of people we expect to see in Mexico or Peru or one of those countries. So again, it was fascinating to me. Like, how can there be that many Black people in Brazil and I didn't know about this? And then the next question was, how come they couldn't give me an accurate number? I mean, at the time, if I'm not mistaken, at that time in the late 90s, it was estimated that the African American population was about 36 million at that time. So I was like, I'm thinking, why is it that they can't give me a more precise number? How can you go from, 50 million to 120 million? And, other estimates say at the time, oh, well, there's about 8 million Black people in Brazil. And it's like, well, how can you have such a wide range of estimates of the Black population? And like I said, I'm going to get to that in a minute. But another thing that I can remember from my past that would introduce me to this situation of race in Brazil was a situation where my father and I, we were avid sports fans. And I can remember, we would watch, baseball on Saturdays, we would watch football on Sundays and basketball whenever it was on. And I remember one particular Saturday afternoon, I think we were watching the Chicago Cubs and the Cincinnati Reds. And I'll never forget this baseball player. This player came to the plate. I think he was a shortstop, and his name was Ivan de Jesus. I'll never forget that. But I'm listening to the announcer talking about Ivan de Jesus, and he says, blah, 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 he's Hispanic or, Hispanic player. And in my mind, Hispanic looks, something like Eric Estrada or, the actor Eric Estrada or, like the boxer Roberto Duran. That's what Hispanic meant to me. So I'm looking at my father and, I'm a little bit confused. I'm like, Daddy, why did he call him Hispanic? Ivan de Jesus just looks like any black guy you'll see walking down the street. Obviously Negroid features, brown skin, kinky curly hair. And my father responded, he says, well, I can't remember if he said he was Puerto Rican or Cuban. I can't remember, but, and that's what my father's reasoning for why Ivan de Jesus was called Hispanic. It didn't really answer my question because I was still confused. And I says to myself, like, he looks black to me. So anyway, that was really my first experience with this question of what's the difference between black if you're born in North America versus if you're black and you're born in Latin America or the Caribbean, because it's not always the same thing. So that would pop into my mind when I started digging into Brazil, because that was my first real experience with that, this question of blackness in Latin America. So for those of you who may not be familiar with how race functions in Brazil, I thought I would start my introduction to my channel, Black Brazil Today, with an introduction to racial classification and terminology in Brazil, because it often gets kind of confusing, particularly if you're from the United States and you're used to just thinking of race, just, black, white, Hispanic, or whatever. And remember, in the United States, most people, this is clearly changing, but for the longest time in the United States, any person who had any recognizable African ancestry, will go into what they call the one drop rule. But I'll just say, if you have any known African ancestry, no matter how fair your skin is, how blonde your hair is, if you got blue or green eyes, because of that ancestry, you were still considered black in the United States. And, it's a historical precedence, because you can find several stories online about people who look like they're, for all intents and purposes, look white, but because of that African ancestry, they still get categorized as black. This is not something that you're going to find in Latin America, where in Latin America, if you look white, you're just white. It doesn't matter if you have indigenous or African ancestry. If you look white, for all intents and purposes, you are accepted as white, even if you fall under this category that I hear people use sometimes. It's called Brazilian white. It's kind of like, we know you're not purely European, but you're white enough here. So anyway, to get into this first, in order to build a basis for what this channel is going to be discussing, I wanted to talk about this racial classification and terminology in Brazil, because it can get kind of confusing if you're just accustomed to the black-white categorization that we do in the United States. So this is one of my very first articles from November 20th of 2011, and the young lady you're looking at here, her name is Camila Pitanga. She's an actress. She's a well-known actress in Brazil. And I'm going to get into her story just a little bit later, because really her story exemplifies everything that I'm talking about that I need to explain about how race functions in Brazil. But just to get started, let's go through this article real quick. So in Brazil, there are actually 5 officially recognized racial classifications on the official census. Those terms are pardo, P-A-R-D-O, which loosely means brown or mixed race or mestizo. Preto means black. Branco means white. Amarelo literally means yellow, but it refers to anyone of Asian descent. And then you have Índio, which refers to Brazil's native Brazilian population. Now, this is where we get into some tricks. to understand the difference between, okay, you say there's 8 million blacks in Brazil, or somebody else saying there's 100 million. The term pardo can have several meanings, including brown, mulatto, mestizo, or any combination of mixed race or racial admixture. Activists of the Movimento Negro, which is Brazil's a loose umbrella term that speaks on Brazil's black civil rights organizations, they have long argued that the terms preto and pardo should be combined and recognized as Brazil's Afro-Brazilian population. This argument is based upon numerous social economic studies and quality of life statistics that show that the profiles of pretos and pardos are nearly identical, while these same stats show that Brazil's white or Bronco population is much better off than those identified as preto or pardo. Now, just to be clear, we should understand this is not to say that, all people classified as white are well off in Brazil. There's plenty of poor white people in Brazil also. But, even studies still show that even within poverty, the poor white population is still better off than the black and brown population. Another thing that I need to explain here is that when I talk about black and brown, preto y pardo in Brazil, it's not the same as speaking on black and brown as in the United States, where there's a distinct difference between people of African descent and people of generally Hispanic Latino descent. When we talk about brown in the United States, people generally are speaking of people from Latin America who don't look black. And it's really based on a separation of cultures, because people that are listed as Hispanic or Latino are generally immigrants that come into the country, or you have, Latinos whose families have been in the United States for, decades, or generations, but they're still of this Latino or Hispanic origin. And it denotes this difference where Latinos are actually from a different culture and from Latin America, whereas the African-American population is US born. When I talk about black and brown in Brazil, we're talking about all Brazilians. It's just that when we say preto, it's more of a person who's more of a clear African phenotype. This person is clearly black, whereas a pardo may be any sort of mixture, or it could be just a person who's black but doesn't like to define himself as black. So you don't have this cultural difference and ethnic difference that you would have between black and brown in the United States. When we're talking about preto and pardo in Brazil, it's, native people who are born in Brazil, but either they're classified as preto or pardo, but, we're talking about Brazilians here. The pardo classification can get, quite a bit complicated. There are those who argue that not all of Brazilians pardos are black. For example, a person of mixed European Indian background with no or negligible amounts of African ancestry would not be seen as black. But if we count all pardos as black, even that person would be considered black. And I have to weigh in on that and say that my views on what's considered black, pardo, and preto in Brazil these days is different from my understanding when I first started looking into Brazil 2 decades ago. That's something else I have to get into another time. There are also people who recognize that their skin color, features, and racial background would classify them as pardos, but that identify themselves as black, or using the Portuguese terms negro or negra, masculine and feminine. So this is basically saying you have a lot of people here who, even though they'll classify themselves on the census form as pardo or parda, meaning brown, they see themselves as being black, but just having a lighter skin complexion, right? So that a pardo can look like almost anything in Brazil. These types of persons may also define themselves as branca or white. Just depends on what they look like and their identity. There are 2 terms which mean black in Brazil: preto, P-R-E-T-O, and negro, of course, as Americans pronounce Negro. Activists of the Movimento Negro have distinguished the two in this way. Speaking of preto and negro, both meaning black. Preto is generally a generic term that refers to the actual color, as when we talk about black and white photos, for example. In this case, the terms preto and branco refer to actual colors in the color spectrum, whereas the term negro or negra refers to one's ethnic identity or a term signifying persons who accept that their ancestry is mostly or partially African. The term negro or negra does not actually appear on the Brazilian census. There's preto and then there's pardo, and you branco and then the other two categories. Now, generally, a person who is considered a preto or preta is a person that has either very dark skin or we'll just say it's a person who has a clearly black phenotype. They have, generally brown or dark brown skin with very tightly curled hair and other facial features that are stereotypically associated with persons of West Africa. When discussing persons of African descent, the difference between a preto and a pardo is not always clear. For some, if a person's skin is not jet black, although their physical appearance clearly denotes African ancestry, this person can also be classified as pardo or parda, or just saying this person is of African descent of a brown skin color. And, again, what is brown to you? For some people, brown skin means somebody that has my complexion, whereas you could use brown to describe somebody with a light skin complexion like Camila Pitanga that I pointed out at the beginning of this article. Gets confusing. I mean, what does a pardo look like? I mean, this term and this term moreno that I'm going to talk about, just in a few minutes, they can really be kind of confusing if you're not accustomed to using that term. So other popular terms denoting race or color in Brazil include morena, moreno, mulata, mulatto. Now, of course, Americans would be familiar with the term mulatto. It was actually on the American census once upon a time, just to signify a person of mixed African and European ancestry. Today, the term moreno is clearly the most popular term used in Brazil to classify. It can classify a white person or a black person, or a person who's just racially mixed that you can't really define them. I have to explain that a little bit more. But another thing about the term moreno is that it's another term that's not actually on the Brazilian census. A moreno can have almost any physical appearance with the exception of extremely pale persons of mostly European descent or appearance. And this also excludes persons with blonde or red hair. So basically, a moreno can be almost anything, save blonde or redheads, right? A moreno can be a white person with a tan and or dark hair. A moreno can be a person of any combination of mixed race who is difficult to define as simply black, white, or Indian. A moreno can be a person of obvious African ancestry, light or dark skin, straight, curly, wavy, kinky hair, who just prefers not to be referred to as black, meaning preto or negro. There has been a long debate in Brazil about removing the terms preta and pardo from the census and including only the term negra. But the flip side of that is many would argue that this would push some persons of mixed ancestry to actually choose to define themselves as white instead of black. In reality, many persons who define themselves as branca or white in the Brazilian census may not be accepted as white in European countries or even in the US. The addition of the term morena to the Brazilian census has also been considered. The problem in this case would be that this could give a very confusing portrayal of the country's racial reality, as both persons of primarily European ancestry and appearance, tanned or with dark hair, could use this term, as could persons of mostly or partial African ancestry and any other combination of racial admixture. Now, as you can imagine, this probably sounds a little bit confusing. I'm sure that probably sounds a little bit confusing to people who may not be accustomed to how race and color terms break down in Brazil. So I wanted to give you an idea how sometimes this can be confusing, even when some people are on the same page in this discussion. Sometime last year, actually, it might have been in 2018, I was having this a kind of a debate with a friend of mine. There's a group of us African Americans that live here in Sao Paulo, and a couple live in Rio. There's a few that live in Bahia in the Northeast. And this had to do with an article that I had posted some time ago. I think it was from 2018. Let me pull this article up if I can. Let's see. Okay, yeah, this is it right here. Now, this is about a popular singer here named Ludmilla. Ludmilla became famous. Ooh, I had just got here several years ago when she put out a song and just put it out on YouTube. You know, that song was just, it seemed like every day I would hear that song. Just being in the streets, I would hear that song every day. And she got a music contract from it. And her career has just blown up since then. She's I think they said she's the top she has the most Instagram followers of any black woman in Brazil. She's been in commercials. You see her face in different advertisements. She's like the poster girl from some for certain products. So Ludmilla has done pretty well for herself. She's, you know, I've talked to quite a bit about her on the blog. Um, but this particular article I posted, I called it Singer Ludmilla reveals that she prefers Moreno, dark men, not too well hung, because you shouldn't have to feel pain. So I asked, is she admitting that she prefers white men? Now, I didn't see it the way that my friend saw it. She interpreted what I posted as, oh, so what are you automatically making the assumption that white men have small penises? I'm like, I never thought about that, but that's not what I was saying. I was more looking at the term moreno. The term moreno, I'm looking, when she says she prefers moreno men, does she mean she means black men, white men, men who may be racially indefinable? I was just confused by her using that term. You know, I didn't even get into the whole, you know, the well hung. That wasn't even part of my question. But when she and I were having this discussion, she says, well, she said moreno. I think she's talking about black men. I'm like, okay, she could be, but she could be talking about white men also. Now, just so you know, historically, the term moreno comes out of the term Moor. And in Portuguese, Moor is translated as mortal. And we all know the story of the Moors from, say, 14th, 15th century, you know, 7th, 8th century in Spain and Portugal. And there's still a discrepancy for a lot of people and historians. You know, some people who will say that a moreno is a, you know, a person of Arab descent with dark hair, whereas other people will say Moors are jet black Africans. And we know that, you know, centuries ago, black people were referred to as Moors. So the word is clearly there, and it clearly is associated with darkness or blackness. Um, Another term that we can find that gives you hints of this, like the term BlackBerry. I don't mean the cell phone, but BlackBerry, like the actual fruit. In Portuguese, the term is amora. So you get this more word once again in place of where the term would be translated in English as black. So amora in Portuguese means blackberry in English. So, but just to give you an idea, it's like she wasn't wrong for what she said. I mean, she could, Ludmilla could have been talking about a black man. But let's go to a Google image search, for example, just so I can show you that a moreno can look like anything except for a blonde or redhead. Here you go to Google Images and you punch in the term homens morenos, which just basically means moreno men. And you get all of these different phenotypes. You got white men with dark hair. You got lighter skinned black men. You got black men who could be of mixed race. Just, you know, look at all of the diversity of phenotypes that you got here. So when someone says, oh, I'm going out with a guy tomorrow, he's, you know, he's living on the moreno side, it's like, okay, well, you're saying he's dark as in tall, dark, and handsome, as how white people define tall, dark, and handsome, being fair skinned but having a darker complexion? Or do you literally mean a black man? It's hard to say. So you look at, even in Google Images in Portuguese, when you look at the term morenos, and you get almost any kind of man here. So both of us could have been right, but by Ludmilla using that term, it just left us a little bit confused as to what, you know, what type of man is she talking about? Is she talking about a black man, a white man, or a man who is just not racially, his identity is not necessarily clear? It's, you know, it could go either way. It's really hard to say. Let me see here. Where else do I want to go with this discussion? Let me go back to the original article on racial classification. Um, okay, so a lot of this I've already covered when I talked about Henry Louis Gates making reference to 136 terms that Brazilians used on the 1976 census. So we've gone through some of this. As of 2010, it was actually reported in a lot of international news sites that Brazil had become a black majority country for the first time in decades, right? Officially says, bro, this was what I wrote. In 2010, the Brazilian census reported that the combination of percentages of persons defining themselves as either preto or parda combined surpassed the total of those people identifying themselves as branca or white for the first time since the 1890 census. So here's a percentage breakdown according to the 2010 census, where they list brancos or white people as 47.3% of the Brazilian population, pardos or brown or mixed 43.1%, pretos 7.6%. Now, again, according to Afro-Brazilian activists, pardos and pretos should be in the same group. So when you add the 43.1 plus 7.6, you come up with 50.7%, which would say thus they represent a slight majority of the population. But that's how I would have saw it, when I first started studying Brazil. My view on what constitutes the black population is not the same as it was when I first started studying Brazil. And that's something that I'll have to get into another time. Right now, I just want to introduce people to the complexities of looking at race from Brazil, because as I go on, I'll have to keep making references to racial classification in Brazil, because it's not exactly what you see in the United States. So going on here, let me see. Okay, let's go down to this section right here. When I get into this whole question of morena, what is morena? What is black? What is white? What is mixed? Now, obviously, Brazil being a Latin American country, people don't define themselves as Latinos or Latinos in Brazil. Matter of fact, what I've learned is that Brazilians don't want to be, you have a lot of Brazilians in the United States, maybe a million, might be less than that, because a lot of people have been returning home because of, economic crises. But there were up to, I know, over 1 million Brazilians in the United States up to at least, I don't know, maybe 6 years ago. They do not want to be considered Hispanic or Latino, to be mixed in with that community, even though they're from Latin America. They like to have their own category. We're Brazilians, right? So you don't have the Latino category unless you're talking to a Brazilian who speaks English. Then some of those people will sometimes adopt the term Latino, because they know that they wouldn't necessarily pass as white in the United States, but in Brazil they're considered white. So it's like, okay, they have this category they'll call Brazilian white. But the actress Camila Pitanga, whose picture that I showed at the top of this article when I started talking, she's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Camila Pitanga she actually identifies herself as black, but when I show her, when I show a picture of people, when I show a picture of Camila Pitanga to people who've never heard of her, and they look at her picture, I get all types of responses. Some people say she looks like a white girl with a tan. Some people say she's Latino. Some people say she's a light-skinned black woman. It just depends. This is why I'm saying her phenotype explains perfectly why I'm saying we can never get an exact number of how many black and white people you have in Brazil. Pitanga is a light-skinned actress who defines herself as negra or black. The Movimento Negro also defines Pitanga as negra, but due to negative connotations associated with blackness in Brazil, Pitanga is often classified in the press as a morena, and reports being constantly asked why she insists on defining herself as negra or black. And that's something, obviously that speaks much to what I talk about on this blog. And I had an article that was dealing specifically with that. In this article from 2012 says, Camila Pitanga on people questioning her blackness. It's as violent as if I was barred from a restaurant or a hotel because of my color. So just, I broke down a little bit of, her career. But for this article, I really wanted to get into what she feels about, she defines herself as black. And in Brazil, that's just like, if you look like Camila Pitanga, you're not expected to define yourself as black. So let's check out what she had to say about this. Let's see. Over the years, Camila has also had to deal with an issue that many black Brazilians deal with on a daily basis, particularly those that possess a lighter skin tone, the question of identity. Camila also addressed this issue. It may be strange, but sometimes I'm embarrassed for not having remarkable stories of racism in my life. As much as I insist on reaffirming my Black roots, people always think the opposite. It's very uncomfortable, and it is as terrible as the most pure prejudice. From the moment I became known to the general public, the situation became even more evident. I'm used to being stopped in the streets by people who find it strange the fact that my skin is light, my features are aquiline, and my hair is straight. They ask why I insist on saying that I am Black, being so cute. It's absurd. It's as violent as if I was barred from a restaurant or a hotel because of my color. I am very like my mother, the former model Vera Lucia Manais, who has my color. My father, Antonio Pitanga, is Black. There were times when I was very saddened by this attitude, but today I face this more naturally. I don't care. For example, the comments that I heard after being on the cover of Hasa Brazil magazine. Some fans wrote and said that they did not understand the fact of me being interviewed by a publication directed towards Black people. I repeat, I'm Black. Now, just to go back on a couple of things she said here, Hasa Brazil is like the only magazine targeted and mostly consumed by Afro-Brazilians, and it's been out since like 1996. But when you go to magazine stands, it's another article that I've talked much about in the past 7.5 years. You just don't see many Black faces on these covers. So somebody came up with this Hasa Brazil magazine in 96, and Black people just, they snatched it up as soon as it came out because they were so waiting for a magazine that they could see their own faces on. Now, if you can look at this picture right here, Camila says that her mother's color is somewhat similar to hers, and I'm not seeing that. Her mother looks clearly darker than she is, and of course she could have darkened over time. But the other interesting thing about Camila Pitanga, see if I can find this picture. Here's a picture of on the left of Camila with her brother Hawko, and they're actually recreating a pose that her mother and her father did back in the 1970s. Now, I was intrigued by looking at her parents, Antonio and Vera. Like, that's intriguing that she came out. In the beginning, I was a little bit confused because her mother's skin tone was a little bit darker than she was from how she appeared when she was younger. The other thing that's curious about trying to understand how race works in Brazil is the question of Black identity. And I've said this before, you run into people in Brazil who you and I would consider Black, and that person does not define themselves as Black, right? I have several articles on the blog that talk about this one. This one is from 2016, and the title is When I Discovered That I'm Black. How racism is so cruel that it makes it difficult for Black people to recognize themselves as such. You know, take a look at this guy. You know, I don't know about you, but looks like a Black guy to me. But, you know, because of how denigration of Blackness works in Brazil, you get a lot of people who look like him who'll be just like, no, I'm a Moreno, I'm a mulatto, whatever it may be. And this is his story. And I'm not going to read the whole story here, but I find this intriguing because it applies to so many different people in Brazil. He says, like much of the population, I come from a context of miscegenation in which my mother's family is composed of the relationship between indigenous people and white, while the family of my father resisted and is constituted of only Black people. The only non-Black person who transitioned in this family was my mother, who declares herself parda, meaning brown or mixed again. She was the first person, perhaps the only one, that I saw get offended for being called white. And he's saying offended for that because generally a lot of people accept being defined as white as a compliment, whereas being defined as a preto or negro for the person who lacks racial consciousness, that comes across as an insult. He continues, in my early environments of socialization, family and school, I remember being called a moreno, a mulatto, a pardo, moreno jumbo, moreno bonbon, which basically like chocolate brown, and several other euphemisms that Black people are tired of hearing. Because really being Black was and still is for many a problem, an insult. One of my main problems to understanding myself and assuming myself as Black, still difficult for me to explain, will probably be confusing, but I'll try. As I said, my father's family is composed exclusively of Black people. So they are people darker than me. So for me, these people were Black, while I was similar but not equal. There is a non-place in the words of today. I had the impression that positioning myself as a pessoa negra or Black person is to rob the place of speaking of these people who, by what they relayed to me, was more complex than what I experienced. Years later, I discovered that I experienced and still experience the same things. I just didn't know it. Gradually, I began my process of empowerment, a never ending process. And there have been some discoveries. One day when I was 15, due to my appearance, I never thought of myself as handsome. While combing my hair unwittingly, I pulled it up. I realized that although it was cabello cacheado, meaning curly, type 3C, it was pulled all to the top. And I saw that it formed a black power, which people call, they refer to an afro here as a black power. I felt incredible, beautiful, and powerful. What this guy's story is going through is telling you his process of becoming black, as they say here. Because again, let's take a look at what this guy looks like. You have a lot of people who look like him, could be darker, could be lighter, and they don't necessarily define themselves as black because they've been conditioned to avoid defining themselves as black. So you have a lot of stories on this blog where people are talking about becoming black. So this is why I say again, why it's so difficult to come to a precise number. How many black people does Brazil have? It can be anywhere from 16 million to 100 million. How people, people who count pretos and pardos together as black, they'll come up with a figure like 100 million. I'm somewhere in the middle these days. Let me get back to what I was talking about here. I will include all of these articles in the description so that you can read the full articles if you like. But let me get back to the finishing up this article here. Let me see. In a 10-year period, people defining themselves as pretos increased from 6.2 to 7.6%. While those, this is talking about the 2010 census, while those defining themselves as brancos decreased from 53.7 to 47.3%. So what is the reason for this slight change in group classification percentages? There are simply too many factors to consider in order to come to a conclusive response. The increase in pretos and pardos could be due to an ongoing self-esteem and Black identity campaign initiated by the Movimento Negro that encourages people to assume their African ancestry, which for many years was a source of shame for people who could not pass for branca. This could have the effect of having people who formerly defined themselves as branca redefine themselves as pardo or even preta, as well as people formerly defining themselves as pardas reclassifying themselves as pretas. Now, this is intriguing because another thing that I've seen, we've been keeping our eye on this for several years now. And as I was just mentioning, we're seeing this increase of people who consider themselves to be Black, and they're identifying themselves specifically as preta rather than, parda, where you have to assume, well, is this person Black or not? Are they mixed or brown, or what are they considering themselves? This is an article from just last year. In the past 6 years, the number of Brazilians defining themselves as specifically Black has increased by 32%. This goes into what I've talked about before. How can you have such a discrepancy? And you look at the title of these articles, basically, the one on the top says, with the increase of self-declaration, Brazil has 115 million Black people. On the other hand, the other article says, the number of Black people increased by 32.2% from 2012 and 2018, coming to a total of 19,227,000 people. How do you have such a huge difference between 115 million and 19 million? Well, it's because the Movimento Negro classifies Black people as pretos and pardos together, whereas this statistic is specifically speaking on how many people the increase of how many people specifically define themselves as preto in that last census. So this is why you have this huge discrepancy of how many Black people you have in Brazil. There are a number of people within the pardo category that for me and you would be considered Black, but then there are so many people who are simply racially indefinable. It's just impossible to say how many Black people you have in Brazil. It just depends on what your perspective is. I've met people in some of my discussions online. I've said this: we'll never come to a conclusive determination of who is Black, because some people will say, well, if you got at least one Black parent, you're Black. You got other people who say, well, her mother is Black, that makes her Black. You got other people who say, well, her grandmother is Black, so she's Black. You got other people who say, well, if he doesn't have two Black parents, then he's not Black. So it just, which side do you land on? It's impossible to say because everybody has a different definition of what it means to be black. Getting back to the points that I was just making, there are too many factors to consider and coming to a conclusive response about explaining this increase in the black population. So I just went through number one. Number two says interracial marriage and relationships make up a significant proportion of Brazilian unions. It is possible that more children of these unions are being classified as parda or preta by their parents. Throughout the history of Brazil, millions of parents have wished for their children to have a more European physical appearance. And oftentimes, these parents will define their children in categories denoting a lighter skin color. This author, myself, can attest to many very dark-skinned Brazilians being classified as pardas on their birth certificates. I've seen it. It's pretty common to find people who have the same complexion as Michael Jordan, and they'll be listed as parda or brown on their birth certificate. It's just nobody wants to be black, right? Now, of course, I'm not speaking on now. I'm saying for many decades it was that way. That's been changing, specifically over the last decade. Number three, although whiteness continues to be the most valued racial classification in Brazil, some people who have thought of themselves as white may not see themselves as so white when they compare themselves to the whiteness of actors on Brazilian television or the globalized images of whiteness coming from both Europe and the United States. There are many other possible factors, and considering all of these factors, there may never be a precise measure of the racial composition of Brazil, but it remains a spirited discussion that continues to provoke many heated debates and opinions. So anyway, that is my introduction to my channel, Black Brazil Today. As I said, I will be posting the links in the description of this video. If you like the content of this video, make sure that you follow this page, follow this channel, like this channel, share this channel. I'm just getting in this game, but as I said, I've been blogging since about November of 2011. So if you're interested in going directly to some of my sources, the blackwomenofbrazil.co is basically my, that's my blog, but that's my source site. You can go there and see the full articles. And as I've been blogging for almost 9 years, you'll have more than 3,300 articles there. So go over there, knock yourself out, look at some articles, punch in the keywords, whatever you're looking for, and, have fun. I'll be checking in with you at the next video. Once again, this is Marcus coming at you from the Black Brazil Today channel, where I discuss Brazil from a perspective of race. Check in with you next time.